Sherlock Holmes and the Windowless Room at Gresham House. Chapter 1. The Windowless Room at Gresham House. Of the many peculiar cases I had the privilege of observing alongside Sherlock Holmes, there are few that haunt my memory with such quiet intensity as the affair of the Windowless Room at Gresham House. It was a morning shrouded in a pewter sky, the air damp with the smell of old fog and coal smoke drifting through Baker Street. The fire in our sitting room had burned low, and Holmes was, as ever, engrossed in an experiment whose purpose escaped me entirely. I was halfway through the Times, sipping lukewarm tea, when a firm knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson had barely opened it when the unmistakable voice of Inspector Lestrade rose from the threshold. "Urgent matter, Dr. Watson. Is Holmes in?" Lestrade entered before I had time to reply, his bowler hat in one hand, his notebook in the other, and an unusually troubled look on his narrow face. "Lestrade," Holmes said, without looking up from the row of test tubes he was arranging, "you only knock with such insistence when baffled, which is always promising." Lestrade took a seat by the fireplace. "It's Gresham House, Holmes. A gentleman has been murdered. The situation is, well, it's not just unusual, it's impossible." Holmes turned at that. "Impossible?" he echoed, rising. "You pique me already, Lestrade. Proceed." "The victim is the Honourable Reginald Branscombe, 32 bachelor, a man of no occupation and considerable fortune, lived alone in Gresham House, Kensington. This morning he was found stabbed to death in his study." Holmes tilted his head. "A regrettable but all too common tale." "It's the room," Lestrade said, lowering his voice. "That's what makes it extraordinary. The study has no windows, no fireplace, no ventilation shafts wider than a postage stamp. The only entrance is a heavy oak door, locked from the inside. The key was still in the lock, on the inside." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "And the body?" "Slumped over his desk. Single stab wound just below the rib cage. Clean. No sign of a struggle. The study was untouched. Ink dried on the pen in his hand. No weapon found. And, this is where it gets stranger, tied in a neat bow around the pen was a blue silk ribbon." "A ribbon?" Holmes echoed, already drifting toward the window as though the case had reached through it to grasp his imagination. "Yes," Lestrade said. "And not just any ribbon. We believe it matches those worn regularly by Lady Havering, the victim's former fiancée." Holmes's face showed the faintest quiver of amusement. "A sentimental clue. A flourish. But tell me, where is Lady Havering now?" "Wiltshire. Married to the Earl of Wilverton. She claims not to have seen Mr. Branscombe in over a year. Says the engagement ended badly and they've had no contact since." Holmes turned abruptly. "But the ribbon appears in the locked room of her former lover, tied around the implement of his final act. Curious. Curious indeed. Who discovered the body?" "His housekeeper, Miss Dorey. Elderly, reliable, worked for the Branscombes since Reginald was a child. She says he retired to the study after supper last evening, as he often did. She knocked at 7:30 this morning and, hearing nothing, used her copy of the key to enter. Found him dead. No one had entered or left. No disturbance in the corridor. No footprints. No trace of intrusion." "And no hidden panels or secret doors?" Holmes asked. Lestrade shook his head. "We had the walls tapped, the skirting boards examined, even brought in a man from the Home Office. Solid stone and panelling. The room is a box with a single locked opening. We've not had the like since the Cornwall case." Holmes rubbed his hands together with satisfaction. "Then, my dear Watson, we are presented with a puzzle worthy of the name. A sealed room, a dead man, and a ribbon from a woman who should have no connection to the event. What more could one ask? Lestrade looked vaguely affronted. A solution for one. Scotland Yard will be under the hammer if this gets into the press. The Branscombes are well connected. You'll come, of course. Immediately, Holmes said, snatching up his coat. Watson, bring your notebook. There is logic in this seeming impossibility, and I intend to find it. As we left Baker Street behind and boarded a cab for Kensington, Holmes was uncharacteristically silent. I ventured a few remarks about Branscomb's social circle and the general security of Gresham House, but he responded only with nods and muttered calculations under his breath. When I pressed him, he said, "No theory, Watson." "Not yet. Only a question." "What question?" "How does one enter a room that cannot be entered, leave a body, and vanish without a trace, and leave behind a symbolic gesture?" "You think the ribbon was deliberate?" Holmes smiled thinly. "Everything is deliberate when death is involved. Gresham House was a handsome old building set back from the road behind wrought iron gates. The butler admitted us solemnly and led us down a long carpeted hall until we reached the door of the study. A constable stood outside it, arms folded, his face as blank as the stone floor. Inside, the study was dim, the lamps unlit. The only light came from a tall oil lamp beside the desk, which cast long shadows across the walls. The room was indeed sealed, a square chamber with thick oak bookshelves, dark panelling, and no visible window or vent larger than a finger's width. Branscombe lay with his head resting on one arm across the blotter. A dark stain had spread beneath him, but there was no sign of disarray. His hand still loosely grasped a pen, and around that pen was a blue ribbon tied in a dainty loop, as if a gift had been presented. Holmes stood motionless for a full minute, his eyes flickering over the floor, the furniture, the bookshelves, the hinges of the door. Then he knelt, drew a small magnifying lens from his pocket, and examined the base of the desk. I said nothing, as I had learned not to disturb him during these initial observations. He made no exclamation, no note, only a faint twitch of the brow as he rose. "Well?" Lestrade said impatiently. "Does it make sense to you?" Holmes replied, "Not yet, but it will. The room is silent now, but it has spoken once, and I intend to make it speak again." With that, he turned to the door. "Watson, the game is afoot." Chapter 2. The first interview. Holmes stood over the desk for another moment, his keen gaze sweeping the ink-stained blotter, the immaculately tied ribbon, and the faint impression of the victim's final posture. He made no immediate comment, though I noted the peculiar tightening of his mouth. The expression he wore when a fact, half perceived, hovered just out of logical reach. Lestrade, with his usual impatience, cleared his throat. "Would you like to see the rest of the house, Mr. Holmes? The staff are gathered, and we've cordoned off the corridor." "In good time," Holmes replied quietly. "First, I wish to speak with Miss Dorey, the housekeeper. Watson, you will observe her carefully and take note of the way she speaks, not merely what she says." Miss Dorey was ushered in a few minutes later. She was a spare, grey-haired woman with a rigid posture and down-turned lips, dressed all in black, as if the house itself had absorbed the solemnity of the morning. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, not a tremble betrayed her. "You have served the Branscombe family for a long time, Miss Dorey?" Holmes asked, motioning for her to sit. "Since I was 15, sir, 41 years. "And Mr. Reginald, he lived here alone?" "Entirely alone. No family in the house since his parents passed. He had friends in town, but he was a private gentleman, kept to his routines. Tell me of last night. She blinked slowly. He dined in the main hall at 8, roast lamb, a glass of claret. Then he retired to the study, as was his habit. I cleared the table. No guests, no callers. I heard the study door close around 9:30. That was the last sound from him. You didn't think to disturb him before this morning? He often worked late, sir, reading or writing. He valued his solitude. And the door, when you found it locked this morning, what then? I knocked twice. No answer. I used my copy of the key to open it, and found him like that. Her voice wavered just slightly, and she looked down at her clasped hands. Were there any other keys to the study? Only his, which was in the lock on the inside, and mine, which I used. No one else would have had one. Holmes paced slowly, then stopped beside the fireplace, not that it had seen use, for there was no flue. You never noticed anything unusual in recent days? Any visitors? She hesitated. Miss Dory, Holmes said gently, a man does not die by accident in a locked room. What you may think trivial could well be crucial. She pursed her lips. He received a letter 3 days ago. I do not know the sender. He burned it immediately after reading it. Unusual for him. He usually kept correspondence. Did you see his mood change afterward? He became withdrawn, more than usual. He didn't sleep the next night. I heard him pacing in his room past midnight. Did he mention the letter to you? No, sir. Did he have any contact with Lady Havering in recent weeks? She flinched. No, sir. Not for over a year, not since the engagement ended. He never spoke of her, though sometimes he would carry a ribbon, a blue one, folded in his wallet. I only noticed it once. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. Thank you, Miss Dory. One final question. Do you lock your own door at night? I do, sir. Good. Always wise, even in respectable houses. Once she had gone, Holmes turned toward Lestrade. She's telling the truth, he said quietly. Or at least her version of it. You're satisfied? Asked Lestrade. Number. But I'm interested. Watson, come. Let us now inspect the remainder of Gresham House, beginning with the corridor. The corridor outside the study was long, panelled, with a red runner carpet and gas lamps spaced at even intervals. The constable had done a good job keeping it undisturbed. Holmes knelt and examined the floor near the door. No scuff marks, no disturbance of the runner, dust patterns unchanged, which is precisely what I expected. Lestrade frowned. You mean to say no one came or went? No one opened that door from the outside after it closed last night. We proceeded through the house, high-ceilinged rooms with polished floors, thick drapes and oil portraits. Holmes paused occasionally, laying a hand on a windowsill or peering behind furniture. When we reached the back staircase leading to the servants' quarters, he spent several minutes inspecting the base of the stairs, then straightened. Now, he said, I should like to speak with the butler. Mr. Elmsley, the butler, was a short man of impassive countenance. His white hair was meticulously combed, and his waistcoat was without a wrinkle. You've served Mr. Branscombe long? Holmes asked. Only 2 years, sir, since the last butler retired. Did Mr. Branscombe receive any visitors in the past week? Elmsley hesitated. One. A Mr. Tarrington. Well-dressed gentleman, a solicitor, I believe. Said he came on personal business. Mr. Branscombe received him in the drawing-room. He left after 15 minutes. Did you hear the nature of their conversation? No, sir. I did not eavesdrop. Of course not, Holmes murmured. But you recall Mr. Branscombe's expression afterwards. He was pale, sir, and quiet. He went directly to the study and stayed there until evening. And the ribbon. Had you ever seen it before? No, sir. Holmes dismissed him with a nod. We must find this Mr. Tarrington. Lestrade made a note. I'll have someone trace him through the London directories. As we returned to the study, Holmes stepped once more into the windowless chamber and stood for a long moment in silence. Then he turned to me. Well, Watson, what do you make of it? A murder in a locked room, the key on the inside, no weapon, and a ribbon left behind, I said. Every explanation feels inadequate. Holmes smiled. Precisely, which means we must look for an explanation that does not rely on appearance. He turned toward the desk. There is one possibility I am already beginning to entertain. But it must wait until I have confirmed two small details. And how will you do that? I shall make an unannounced visit, Holmes replied. Tonight, to Wiltshire, to Lady Havering herself. Chapter 3. The Woman in Wiltshire. The evening train carried us through the damp, sloping fields of southern England, the windows fogged faintly with the lingering breath of summer's retreat. Holmes had taken a compartment to himself and reclined with his eyes closed, hands steepled under his chin, not asleep, but in that curious meditative state that always heralded the silent forging of his deductions. I did not disturb him. My notebook lay unopened on my lap. It was nearly 10 when we arrived at the modest station near Havering Court, the ancestral home of Lady Eleanor Havering, formerly betrothed to Reginald Branscombe. A dog-cart had been arranged. The road was narrow and wound between ancient hedges that trembled with the sigh of the wind. I felt, rather than saw, Holmes stir beside me. You have not asked, he said suddenly, why we come to her tonight. I had assumed, I replied, that you wished to test her reaction to the news. He gave a small grunt of approval. Just so. But also, because if this case pivots on hidden history, as I suspect, then that history must live within her. And in history, Watson, motive finds its root. We were received at the door by a young maid who eyed us with uncertainty before disappearing to fetch her mistress. The drawing room into which we were shown bore the unmistakable marks of fading grandeur, drapes just slightly thinned, silver less polished, flowers in need of replacing. Holmes examined it all without a word. Lady Eleanor entered 5 minutes later. She was a tall woman, still striking in her mid-30s, her beauty tempered by a cool, almost imperious composure. Her mourning black, I noted, was not for Reginald, for she could not have known yet, but perhaps for some quieter grief known only to herself. Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson, she said with a stiff incline of the head, to what do I owe this unexpected visit? Holmes stepped forward, offering no apology. I regret to bring you ill news, Lady Eleanor. Reginald Branscombe is dead. She did not gasp, she did not stagger. Her face, remarkably, did not change expression in any visible way. But a faint noise, a tightening of the breath, escaped her throat, almost imperceptible. She crossed to the mantel and placed her hand upon it. I see, she said. We believe it to be murder, Holmes continued gently. Now she turned to face him. Murder. In his own house. In his study. A locked-room affair. I would not trouble you with the details tonight, but I must ask a few questions. You understand the urgency. Ask. Did you correspond with Mr. Branscombe recently? Number. Have you seen him? Or had word of him in the past fortnight? Number. And yet your name appeared quite obliquely during our preliminary inquiries. She raised one brow. How so? Holmes reached into his coat and drew out a small notebook. A blue ribbon was found beside the body, tied around a dagger's hilt. Mr. Branscombe, it seems, once carried a blue ribbon in his wallet. His housekeeper believed it to be yours." A long silence followed. The fire in the grate crackled once. "He kept it," she said at last, "after all this time." "So it appears." She looked down, her voice suddenly low. "We were engaged, Mr. Holmes, you know that much. But it ended, not in anger, but in silence. Reginald was a proud man, too proud to accept what I could not give. And what was that? A life of artifice. I was expected to marry for alliance, not affection. My father ensured that. Reginald would not be part of it." "And yet he kept your ribbon." "Yes." Holmes tilted his head. "Do you still love him, Lady Eleanor?" Her answer came without hesitation. "I did. And in some stubborn corner of myself I still do." "Would you have cause to harm him?" Her gaze flared. "None." "Would anyone?" She hesitated. "There was one, Rupert Malden, my current suitor. He once accused Reginald of meddling. He said Reginald's letters to me after the broken engagement were manipulative, that they prevented me from moving forward. Do you have these letters still?" "Number." "I burned them, every one." Holmes nodded slowly. "Is Mr. Malden here?" "Number." "He's in Oxford for a lecture." Holmes was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Lady Eleanor, if I asked you to come to London to identify the ribbon, would you?" "Yes, of course." He turned toward the door, but paused. "One last thing. Did Reginald ever mention a solicitor named Tarrington?" The name clearly meant something. She stiffened, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Then, "Only once. Years ago. Tarrington had been retained by his uncle for an inheritance dispute." Holmes nodded. "Thank you. That confirms something important." He offered her no comfort, only a courteous bow. I followed him out into the night. As we stepped into the cart, I said, "What did that confirm?" "That Tarrington was not a new arrival in Reginald's affairs, which makes his sudden visit this week all the more suspicious." "And Lady Eleanor?" Holmes looked up at the stars. "She is grieving, Watson, but not falsely. The ribbon was not a message from her. It was a message to her. And I believe, when the time comes, it will be she who holds the emotional key to the crime." We rode back in silence, the wheels humming against the dirt road. Behind us, Havering Court glimmered faintly, an old house weighed down by secrets. And ahead, Gresham House waited. So did the locked room, the dagger, and the first threads of truth. Chapter 4. Guests Behind the Wall. The following morning brought with it a London sky so thoroughly washed of colour that it resembled paper left too long in the sun. Holmes, though he had slept scarcely 3 hours, was already at the breakfast table reviewing the local train timetables and jotting indecipherable notes across the inside flap of a cigarette carton. "You intend to return to Gresham House?" I asked as I buttered a slice of toast. "I intend to step inside it again," he replied, "but this time not as a guest. A house, particularly one like Gresham, is not a static thing, Watson. It's a theatre, and each room is a scene. The furniture shifts, the curtains breathe, and secrets nest behind the plasterwork." "You believe something was hidden from us?" "I know it," he said plainly, "and today we begin lifting the wallpaper of this case, both literal and metaphorical." We arrived just before noon. The house seemed to exhale uneasily as we approached. Constable Winthrop, still stationed near the entrance, greeted us with a half-hearted salute. "Inspector Lestrade's inside," he said. "Questioning the guests, sir." "Excellent," Holmes murmured. "Let us join the interrogation. not to lead it, but to observe the distortions it causes. Inside, the guests had been gathered in the drawing room. 5 individuals seated with varying degrees of stiffness and resentment. Holmes introduced us curtly, and we settled into the edge of the room as Lestrade continued his inquiries. The group consisted of Mr. Lionel Carradine, a reedy gentleman in spectacles and a fading frock coat, who claimed to have been a business partner of the late Mr. Branscombe. Mrs. Julia Barstow, a distant cousin, elegant and unsmiling with the faint scent of lavender trailing her speech. Mr. Julian Fortescue, a portly gentleman of uncertain means and certain opinions, who'd already interrupted Lestrade twice to complain about the indignity of being treated like a common suspect. Miss Marjorie Lane, a quiet young woman with striking grey eyes, who appeared to be a companion or secretary to someone present, though it wasn't immediately clear whom. And lastly, Tobias Shale, the butler, an old man with joints as rigid as his speech. His answers came in clipped syllables, wrapped in the formality of decades of service. Lestrade, though eager, was no Holmes. He plodded through his questions with the heavy boots of procedure. Holmes, on the other hand, simply watched, his gaze darting from wrist to cufflink, from the scuff of a shoe to the way a teacup was held or set down. Miss Lane, Lestrade was saying, you mentioned earlier that Mr. Branscombe had been anxious of late. Anxious about what? Her voice was soft. He didn't say, only that he feared he'd made an error years ago, something that might return. An error? She nodded. That's how he phrased it. I assumed it was business-related. Did he receive any correspondence this past week that agitated him? There was a letter from someone named Tarrington. I delivered it myself. He seemed upset by it. Holmes's eyes flicked toward me for a moment, then back to the group. Tobias, Lestrade said, turning to the butler, what do you recall of Mr. Branscombe's final day? I brought him his supper at 6, said Tobias. He took it in the study, as was often the case. I knocked again at 9, but he did not respond. That was not unusual. He disliked being disturbed. And you were the one who found the body? No, sir. It was Miss Lane the next morning. A silence settled. Holmes finally stirred. Forgive the interruption, he said, his voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. But I wonder, Mr. Carradine, when was the last time you and Mr. Branscombe spoke privately? Carradine blinked behind his glasses. Perhaps 2 weeks ago. We had a disagreement about a pending contract. Was it a severe disagreement? I suppose so. I told him I was prepared to withdraw. Holmes leaned back, satisfied with the non-answer. Curious, he murmured. You were prepared to sever a financial partnership, and yet you are still here. Carradine flushed, his fingers worrying at the crease of his trousers. Holmes turned to Tobias. Tell me, is the study ever locked from within? Yes, sir. And when it is, how is it unlocked? There's a skeleton key, sir, but it wasn't used. The door was bolted. So no one could have entered, not unless they had wings. Holmes gave a smile, or unless they were already inside. Lestrade stiffened. Inside. Holmes turned to the group. Gresham House is large and old. I suspect there are more ways to move through it than one might admit. I would like, with your permission, to conduct a structural survey. There is something about the draft in that study, the hollow behind the eastern wall that whispers of a passage no longer used. No one objected, though Mrs. Barstow looked faintly affronted by the idea that her cousin's murder might involve secret corridors like something out of a penny dreadful. Holmes was already moving. I followed him as he passed through the side hall and into the study once more. He moved straight to the bookcase that flanked the eastern wall. "Feel this," he said. I placed my hand against the wooden backing. It was cool, not unusually so, but the way the edge responded to pressure was telling. Holmes pressed, slid his hand upward, then downward, until, with a click and a puff of dust, a narrow panel sprang forward. A recess, shallow and empty. "No passage," I said. "No," Holmes replied. "Not yet, but this house is hiding more than letters and ribbons." He knelt to the floor. "What's more curious is the dust." "What of it?" "Too consistent, too even, no footprints, no smudges. Either this room has not been entered in days, or it was cleaned very precisely." We stood, and I felt a shiver crawl along my spine. "There's something else, isn't there?" I asked. "Yes," Holmes murmured, eyes fixed on the windowless wall. "A question no one has asked." "Which is? How did the murderer know he'd be alone?" He turned. Reginald Branscombe was a man of habit. His killer struck in a moment that required precision. Either the killer had been watching for days, or they were told. He dusted off his knees and straightened his coat. "Watson," he said, "tomorrow we return, not to the house but to the archives. There is a will involved in this affair, a very specific will, and I would wager it was changed twice." As we left the study, I glanced once more at the dead fireplace, the bolted door, and the narrow sliver of wall that had begun to give up its secrets. The game, as Holmes would say, was afoot. Chapter 5. The Man Who Vanished from Paper. The next morning was damp, with a low-hanging fog that crept like suspicion through the streets of London. Holmes and I took a hansom cab to the offices of Winthrop and Coddington, solicitors at law, whose brass plaque glinted modestly beneath the soot-streaked cornices of Bedford Row. According to Tobias the butler, the firm had handled Mr. Branscombe's affairs for nearly 2 decades, managing his estate, drafting amendments to his will, and, according to Holmes, perhaps harbouring more secrets than legal documents. We were shown into a small but well-furnished waiting room, where the scent of lemon oil and ink hung in the air like an unseen clerk. Presently, a balding man with a pressed collar and a nervous gait appeared at the door. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson? I am Mr. Timothy Coddington. How may I assist?" Holmes rose and extended his hand. "A matter of considerable delicacy, Mr. Coddington. We understand that your firm managed the estate of the late Mr. Reginald Branscombe." Yes, tragic business," Coddington stammered. "We were informed by Inspector Lestrade." "Do sit. How may I be of service?" Holmes accepted the offer but leaned forward slightly. "We are interested in the particulars of Mr. Branscombe's last will and testament, specifically whether it had been altered in recent months." Coddington hesitated. "As a rule, sir, we are not at liberty to disclose the terms of a will until it has been executed and admitted to probate. However, given the nature of the investigation and your role in it, I believe an exception is warranted." He unlocked a narrow cabinet and withdrew a bundle of parchment from a folder marked R.B. Revised Testament, July. There were 3 versions, he explained. The original dated 1888, a revision in January of this year, and a final version signed not 3 weeks ago, witnessed by myself and Miss Lane. Holmes flicked his eyes toward me. "Miss Lane served as a witness?" "Yes," said Coddington. "Mr. Branscombe insisted. She was always near to hand, and he trusted her implicitly." Holmes took the top document and read swiftly, lips pressed to a thin line. "Curious," he murmured. "What is it?" I asked. "Look here, Watson. In the January version, the primary beneficiary is Mr. Lionel Carradine, entitled to a controlling share of the South African holdings and all rights to the Branscombe shipping ledger." He turned to the newer copy. "But in the final version, Carradine is all but erased. A token sum of £50 remains in his name. The bulk of the estate, Gresham House, its contents, and the investment portfolio is left instead to Miss Marjorie Lane. I blinked. His secretary. Not just his secretary, apparently. There is a clause describing her as one who has offered him peace in his final years. Rather poetical for a legal document. Coddington shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Branscombe grew increasingly estranged from his business associates in the past year. He confided more in Miss Lane than in anyone else. I advised caution in such a radical amendment, but he was resolute. Holmes placed the papers down carefully. This change in beneficiaries, was it contested by anyone? It had not yet been made public. Only a few were aware. Mr. Carradine, for instance, had not been informed. Then, Holmes said, his voice quiet, someone was very determined to keep it that way. I glanced at him. You believe the motive lies here? I believe the motive lies in absence, Holmes replied. What a man takes from another is telling, but what he prevents another from receiving is more so. Tell me, Mr. Coddington, was there ever an earlier document, a revoked clause, a name that once appeared but now does not? Coddington paused, rummaging through a separate drawer, and after a moment produced an older folio, yellowed at the edges and bound with a faded ribbon. Yes, he said, there was once a provision for a certain Wilfred Tarrington. At the name, Holmes sat back as though struck. He was a distant cousin, Coddington continued, mentioned briefly in 1888, then entirely removed in 1897 following, unfavourable conduct abroad. Abroad? I asked. He was in Ceylon. There was some trouble involving embezzlement, a local magistrate, and a failed plantation. Mr. Branscombe severed ties, both personal and financial. And now? Nothing has been heard of Mr. Tarrington in over 10 years. We presume he is dead. Holmes steepled his fingers, a familiar glint forming in his eyes. On the contrary, Mr. Coddington, I believe Mr. Tarrington has returned, and he has not come for forgiveness. We thanked the solicitor and departed. Once in the cab, I turned to Holmes. You suspect Tarrington is involved? Holmes tapped the window lightly. Miss Lane mentioned a letter from Tarrington days before the murder. What's striking is not the content of the letter, but that it arrived at all. If Tarrington is dead, then someone else used his name. If he is alive, then his claim to the estate, though legally void, may be morally persuasive to a desperate man. Either way, someone knew the changes to the will, and someone ensured Mr. Branscombe would never see them executed. But that suggests an inside hand, someone close. Holmes nodded. Yes. And Watson, observe how everything returns to Miss Lane, a witness to the will, the recipient of the estate, the finder of the body, the bearer of the Tarrington letter. She is either a tragically entangled victim or a far more clever player than she appears. I sat back, stunned. And you don't know which? I intend to, Holmes said, but not with questions. Tonight, we test her truth another way. How? He smiled faintly, by inviting her to lie. And with that, the carriage rattled on through the misty streets toward the evening shadows that awaited us at Gresham House. Chapter 6. The dinner with shadows. That evening, under a sullen sky stained with soot and the orange embers of gaslight, we returned to Gresham House by invitation. Miss Lane had extended the courtesy herself, requesting a private dinner in the drawing-room. To clarify my position, she had said. Holmes had accepted without hesitation, though I saw in his eyes the calculation of a man laying out pieces on a chessboard. It would not be a simple meal. As we stepped once more into the oak-panelled hallway, the scent of waxed wood and coal smoke greeted us, carrying the same silent chill as the night of the murder. Tobias, the butler, admitted us with his usual solemnity, though I detected in him an unease not present before. His gloved hand trembled slightly as he took Holmes's coat. "This way, gentlemen," he murmured, and led us to the same dining room where Mr. Branscom's body had once slumped beside a now polished sideboard. Tonight, the room had been transformed. Candles flickered from silver holders, the table was dressed in white linen, and a modest supper was laid out with a bottle of claret breathing beside it. Miss Lane awaited us by the hearth, her dress simple but elegant, a dark blue that echoed the windowless dusk. Her hair was coiled in the same practical style, yet her bearing had changed. There was no tremble in her hand now, no hesitance in her greeting. She met Holmes's eyes with a composed, almost defiant expression. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming." "You are most gracious, Miss Lane," Holmes replied. "Few murder investigations begin with a claret." Her lip curved faintly. "Perhaps it is an unconventional approach, but I believe you came here tonight to test something. I thought I might do the same." We seated ourselves. As plates were served, roast chicken, small potatoes, and wilted greens, Holmes remained largely silent, observing her. It was not until the soup plates were cleared and Tobias had left the room that he spoke again. "You were Mr. Branscom's secretary for nearly 7 years, Holmes began. "And yet, not once in all our inquiries have you mentioned your time before Gresham House." Her eyes remained level. "Because it is not relevant." "That," said Holmes, "remains to be seen." There was a pause. Then she said, "Very well. I trained in shorthand and accountancy at Miss Stoker's College for Young Women. I was employed by an import firm in Cheapside until 1899, then by a barrister in Lincoln's Inn. Mr. Branscom hired me in the autumn of 1900. "And you never left?" "Not until last week," she said softly, "when he was murdered." The word hung in the air. Holmes steepled his fingers. "Tell me about Wilfred Tarrington." Something flickered in her expression, but she held her ground. "I only know what Mr. Branscom told me, that Mr. Tarrington was a disgraced relative, cut off due to scandal and theft." "You received a letter from him, did you not, days before the murder?" Her voice dropped. "Yes. It was unsigned, but bore his name. He claimed to have returned to England and wished to meet Mr. Branscom to discuss restitution." "Did you show it to Mr. Branscom?" "I did. He burned it in the fireplace without comment." Holmes rose then and walked to the hearth, where the blackened grate still held cinders. "Curious," he said. "A man who carefully preserved receipts and telegrams in alphabetical folders would choose to burn a letter in full." She watched him. It frightened him. "Or," Holmes said, turning, "he knew it was not from Tarrington at all." Silence. The room seemed to lean inward. Watson spoke then, his voice mild. "Miss Lane, forgive the bluntness, but why were you the sole witness to the amended will?" "There was no one else available," she said quickly. "The staff had retired. Mr. Coddington had the document ready. Mr. Branscom insisted." "Did he sign it willingly?" She drew herself up. "Absolutely." "And you swear to that under oath?" "I do." Holmes nodded once. Then he took from his coat pocket a thin, folded square of paper and placed it on the table. "This was found in Mr. Branscom's study, behind the drawer lining. It is the original letter from Wilfred Tarrington." Her face froze. "I took the liberty of comparing the handwriting," he continued. "It matches another note, one you sent to Coddington 6 months ago regarding an insurance matter." You forged the letter." "No," she breathed. "You forged it," Holmes said gently, "to give Mr. Branscombe reason to disinherit Lionel Carradine. You played on his fear, and once the will was changed, you knew the danger. If the forgery was exposed, the New Testament would be invalid. So you remained silent." She was trembling now. "I didn't kill him." "I believe you," Holmes said quietly. Watson blinked. "Then who?" Holmes turned to the window. "That, my dear Watson, is what we must determine. But the truth draws closer. Miss Lane's crime was forgery. Serious, yes, but not fatal. The hand that held the dagger wore another's glove." He turned back to Miss Lane. "You will remain in London. Say nothing to the others. And should anyone confront you, especially Carradine, inform me at once." She nodded silently. As we left Gresham House that night, the fog thickened, rolling down from the rooftops in sheets of silver and grey. Beside me, Holmes lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. "She did not stab him," he said, "but she lit the match that made it possible. And Carradine. Carradine is many things, but not careless. Someone else is threading this web. And soon, Watson, I shall see the pattern." The wind sighed across the rooftops. Somewhere behind us, a window shut with quiet finality. The game had not yet ended, but the board was nearly set. Chapter 7. The portrait in the attic. The following morning dawned in sullen grey, with rain brushing against the window panes of Baker Street like the breath of some restless messenger. I found Holmes already awake and at his desk, poring over a sheaf of documents he had secured from Branscombe's solicitor late the night before. The fire crackled low in the hearth, and a half-drunk cup of tea had grown cold beside his elbow. "Watson," he said without looking up, "have you ever considered how often a painting tells more lies than a witness?" I blinked, still shaking off the cobwebs of sleep. "A painting?" Holmes lifted his eyes to me, fingers tapping a delicate rhythm on the paper. "Gresham House has over 40 portraits of Branscombe's ancestors and patrons. Most are utterly inconsequential. One, however, is missing." "Missing?" I asked, now more alert. "Indeed, there is a blank spot in the upper corridor outside the master bedroom. The hooks remain, but the canvas is gone." "And you believe it matters?" "I believe it was removed recently," Holmes said, standing, "and one does not remove a family portrait in the days preceding a murder without reason. Within the hour we were once again inside Gresham House, the gloom of the corridors welcoming us like an old conspiracy. Tobias, grim and subdued, let us in without question. As Holmes ascended the grand staircase, he paused before the bare spot in the gallery. "Look here, Watson," he said. It was exactly as he'd described, 4 dull brass hooks protruding from the wood panelling, with faint impressions in the dust that suggested a sizable frame had hung there not long ago. Holmes crouched and ran a gloved hand along the wainscoting. "No scuff marks on the wall," he muttered. "Someone removed it carefully. A sound behind us made me start." Tobias, having followed discreetly, now stood a pace behind. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said, "but the painting you speak of, it was taken down by Mr. Carradine. Said it was to be cleaned." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "When?" 3 days before Mr. Branscombe's death." "And where is it now?" "In the attic, sir. It was never fetched." "Show us." Tobias hesitated only briefly, then nodded and led us up a narrow back stairwell that curved like a coiled snake into the spine of the house. The air grew colder as we ascended, and the smell of dust and time pressed against us. The attic was a long, shadowy space, roofed with oak beams that creaked faintly in the wind. Forgotten furniture lay swathed in linen, and shafts of pale light filtered through a small, grimy window at the far end. Tobias guided us to a stack of covered frames leaning against the wall. He pulled back a dust sheet. The portrait revealed beneath it was striking, a stern-faced man in hunting garb standing beside a hound. The subject bore a resemblance to Branscombe himself, though the plaque at the base read Wilfred Tarrington, 1864-1897. Holmes let out a quiet breath. So, the prodigal uncle. He examined the painting minutely, then leaned close, inspecting the lower right corner of the frame. Something had been scraped away. Residue clung to the varnish like dried glue. This frame bore something else, he murmured. A crest, perhaps, or a dedication. It has been deliberately removed. Watson spoke. But what could the portrait reveal? Holmes stepped back. Tarrington was Branscombe's blood. Their resemblance is too close to dismiss, and it confirms what Miss Lane said, that Tarrington existed, and that Branscombe tried to bury him from memory. He turned to Tobias. Did Mr. Carradine say why he wished this painting cleaned? No, sir, only that it was an offence to the house. Holmes straightened. It may soon be an offence to him. We descended in silence. In the front hall, a commotion met us. Raised voices, one of them familiar. As we emerged from the corridor, Lionel Carradine stood in the foyer, red-faced, berating Miss Lane. You had no right to return here, he was saying, his voice thick with fury. Your presence is an insult to my uncle's memory. Mr. Carradine, Holmes said with soft authority, a word, if you please. Carradine turned. His anger flickered, then cooled. Mr. Holmes, I assume you've come to witness Miss Lane's continuing manipulation. I've come, Holmes said, to understand why you removed your uncle's portrait from the hall. Carradine blinked. What? That old thing? It was hideous, a relic. I thought to have it cleaned, then changed my mind. And the plaque on the frame? Holmes asked mildly. Also hideous. Carradine's mouth twitched. I fail to see what this has to do with murder. You may soon see it quite clearly, Holmes replied, stepping closer. Tell me, Mr. Carradine, what did Wilfred Tarrington do to your family that required his image be hidden in the attic? Carradine's face tightened. He betrayed them, stole from his own father, brought shame to the Branscombe name. Isn't that enough? For most, perhaps, Holmes said, but not for murder. Carradine turned on his heel and strode out, slamming the door behind him. Holmes watched the door for a long moment. Then he said softly, He knows more than he pretends. But I no longer believe he killed Branscombe. No? I asked. Holmes shook his head. He's too emotional. The murder was cold, precise, and the truth, Watson, like Tarrington's image, is hidden in plain sight. And with that, he turned back toward the stairwell. The shadow of the attic still clung to his coat. Chapter 8. A whisper behind the wainscot. The wind had turned by afternoon, growing sharper, more insistent. A slate-grey sky pressed down upon Gresham House, and as Holmes and I stepped once more from the oppressive gloom of the upper corridors into the drawing-room, there was a sense that the house itself was drawing in its breath, waiting. Miss Lane sat by the window, a slim silhouette in the fading light, her hands wrapped around a teacup that had long since gone cold. Her eyes, large and unblinking, followed us as we entered. I noted that she had not once inquired after Carradine following his outburst. A curious omission, I thought at the time. Holmes made straight for the escritoire in the far corner, Branscombe's private writing desk, which had remained sealed since the morning of our arrival. He knelt, inspecting the lock. then extracted a thin tool from the inner lining of his coat. "You are aware this may be contested," I said mildly. "Let it be," he replied, the tip of the instrument slipping with a soft click. "Truth lies more often in drawers than in declarations." With the lock disengaged, he opened the top compartment. Inside were neat stacks of correspondence, ledger books, and 2 leather-bound journals. Holmes ignored the papers and reached instead for the smallest item, an envelope, still sealed, addressed in Branscom's precise hand. To be opened only in the event of my death. Holmes glanced at me, but did not hesitate. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter within. As his eyes scanned the lines, his brow tightened. "Well?" I prompted. He handed me the page silently. I read, "To whom it may concern. If this letter is opened, then I must assume the worst has occurred. Know then that I have long harboured suspicions of one within my household. Not for theft or disloyalty, but for something more elusive. Silence. A silence that follows me down the halls, that lingers outside my door, that once scratched faintly behind the wainscot of the windowless room. There is something not right with this house, and someone who profits from that wrongness. I have not dared speak of it to Carradine, nor to Mr. Tobias, who remains loyal but unimaginative, and of Miss Lane I am uncertain. But I have placed something in the locked cabinet behind the library hearth. It may mean nothing, or everything. Reginald Branscombe." Holmes took the page back and reread the final paragraph. "The locked cabinet," he murmured. "Behind the hearth. Curious place for concealment." He was already moving, Miss Lane rising behind him, startled. "You're not going to the library now, but the light." "Will do nothing to aid the dead," Holmes replied, stepping past her. We descended once more into the lower wing. The library at the rear of the house was long and book-lined, with the remnants of a once cosy life, tobacco jars, horsehair rugs, a decanter untouched in weeks. Holmes knelt before the marble hearth, feeling along the base where the wood panelling met stone. "Here," he said, tapping twice, "a false moulding." It sprang back slightly at his touch, revealing a small iron door. Locked, of course. But within moments, Holmes had sprung that too. He reached inside and withdrew a shallow wooden box, wrapped in oilskin and smelling faintly of burnt resin. As he lifted the lid, I leaned forward. Inside was a single item, a narrow ledger bound in green buckram, its corners badly worn. On the spine, embossed in faded gold, Guest Register, Gresham House. Holmes opened it, flipping quickly to the final entries. His finger paused. "Look here, Watson. Branscombe noted every visitor by hand, and see these final entries. Miss Lane on the 12th, Carradine on the 14th, Tobias listed daily, as expected. But on the 16th, there was no entry." "But that was the night before the murder," I said. "Exactly." Holmes turned the page. "And yet the ink here shows disturbance. See the indentations? Someone tore out a leaf. Very recently. Could it have been Branscombe himself? Unlikely. There are no signs of overwriting, and his hand was meticulous. No. Someone visited that night and Branscombe recorded it. Then the page was removed." Holmes closed the ledger gently and stood. "There's more, Watson. Much more. But we need a clearer picture." At that moment we heard a faint sound, like the click of a door at the far end of the corridor. Holmes motioned to me silently, and we stepped into the shadows near the library entrance. Soft footsteps approached, measured, careful. Then a silhouette entered the library. A woman, slender, wrapped in a dark shawl. Miss Lane. She moved straight to the hearth, knelt where Holmes had moments before, and reached behind the same panel. When she found the cavity empty, her body stiffened. She stood slowly, her breath audible. "Looking for something, Miss Lane?" Holmes said, stepping into the light. She turned, startled but not frightened. Her expression changed not to panic, but to weariness. "I suspected you'd find it," she said softly. "He told me you were clever." "Branscombe?" She nodded. "He feared something, I wasn't sure what. But he asked me not to leave, he wanted me nearby in case." Her voice trailed off. Holmes observed her keenly. "Then why did you not tell us about the register?" "I didn't know what it meant," she said. "Only that he grew more agitated in the days before his death. He kept locking his study, waking from dreams, speaking of sounds in the walls." Watson frowned. "You believe he was frightened of the house?" "Not the house," she said. "Of something he thought was returning." Holmes nodded, as if this confirmed a theory already turning in his mind. "Then we are very near the heart of it. There is one place left I must examine, Watson." "The windowless room," I said. "Precisely." And with that we made ready to descend into the oldest part of Gresham House, where the light never touched and silence pressed like a hand against the throat. Chapter 9. Descent into the Forgotten Wing. The passage to the oldest section of Gresham House lay beyond a door, half swallowed by ivy at the rear of the east corridor. Tobias, when pressed, had muttered something about servants' quarters from the days before the war, but the truth was far less mundane. Holmes had noticed the scuff marks on the tiles the day before, scratches that curved inwards like something dragged. I followed him now as he pressed the latch open, and we stepped into a narrow, dust-choked passage. The walls were low, and the air staler than I'd thought possible, carrying with it a peculiar odour of mildew and something sharper beneath, metallic, like old blood or rusting iron. The only illumination came from Holmes's lamp, held steady as we crept forward. "Few houses in England possess such a structure," Holmes murmured. "Not merely old, Watson, forgotten. These bricks speak of Tudor hands." We passed a collapsed section of ceiling and an abandoned side chamber where broken furniture lay heaped. But beyond it was the door we sought, heavy, warped by centuries of moisture, without handle or keyhole. It had clearly not been meant to open frequently. Holmes crouched, inspecting the frame. His fingers traced something faint, a groove scarcely wider than a pencil. "Here," he whispered, tapping the floor with his cane. "Notice the dust, undisturbed along the edges, except at the base. Someone's opened this recently. And look, fibers caught in the crack." He extracted a thin piece of black ribbon, frayed, familiar. "The same type used on the dagger's hilt," I said quietly. Holmes nodded. "Then we are not the first to visit this room since Branscombe's death." With effort, he wedged the end of his cane beneath the door. It groaned as it opened, a low, keening sound that made the hair on my neck rise. Inside was a chamber of stone and silence. The room was perfectly square, perhaps 12 feet to a side. No window, no furniture, just a low platform of brick in the center, like an altar or raised bed, and a scattering of scorched candle stubs on the floor. The walls were bare save for 2 iron hooks embedded high on the far side. They were rusted, but the pattern was unmistakable. Something had once been strung between them, stretched taut, perhaps for years. "Holmes," I said slowly, "what was this room?" He didn't answer. He was already examining the platform, his fingers brushing its surface. A fine layer of grit covered it, interrupted only at the center, where a small rectangle had been disturbed. A box lay here, he muttered. Recently removed. The dimensions match that missing from Branscom's writing desk. I remembered the scuffs near the hearth. And the marks in the corridor? Indeed, someone carried it from here to the study, then, fearing its discovery, returned again to retrieve it after the murder. Holmes' gaze swept the walls. But the greater mystery, Watson, is this. Why was Branscom, rational, educated, modern, so obsessed with this place? Why keep it sealed and hidden from his own household? My answer came involuntarily, because he was afraid. At that moment a sharp snap echoed above us, then silence. Holmes spun, raising the lamp. A rope had broken loose from the upper beam, swinging in a slow, pendulous arc. "I don't like this place," I muttered. "Neither did he," Holmes replied, "and with good reason." He pointed toward the far wall. "There, do you see?" A series of faint black lines had been etched into the stone near the base. I stooped, squinting. "It's writing. But it's smudged." Holmes knelt beside me, brushing away soot. The truth was never buried. It was locked beneath the name. The name is not mine. "Cryptic," I said, frowning. "What does it mean?" But Holmes had already turned, deep in thought. "We must return to the study. There's something about Branscom's name. And his lineage. This house, too. I suspect it bears secrets long predating the present generation." We exited the chamber swiftly. As we stepped back into the corridor, I caught a glimpse, just for a moment, of movement at the far end. A figure retreating into shadow. Holmes paused. "Did you see?" "Yes. Someone's been watching us." Holmes didn't pursue. Instead, he pulled the door closed with a thud. "Let them run. We know now where they return, and in time they must come back for what remains." We made our way back toward the lit rooms above, both quiet with thought. Back in the drawing room, we found Carradine seated by the fire, his face pale and drawn. He rose upon seeing us, his eyes darting. "You were below," he said, "in the cellar wing. Why?" "We follow shadows, Mr. Carradine," Holmes said calmly, "and some of them lead to places long sealed." Carradine hesitated. Branscombe, never let me in there. Said the place wasn't fit for anyone." Holmes nodded. "And yet someone returned, recently, perhaps even during the night." Carradine swallowed hard. "You don't think?" "I never would." "I think," Holmes interrupted, "that all of you in this house have seen more than you admit." He moved toward the mantel and ran his fingers along the wood. "There is more beneath this roof than murder, Mr. Carradine. There is inheritance, memory and fear, and I intend to cut through them all." With that, he turned to me. "Watson, tomorrow we speak to the solicitor. I must know who truly owns this house and who does not." Chapter 10. The solicitor's ledger. The following morning broke with a grey drizzle, and the smell of damp stone lingering across Baker Street. Holmes had hardly touched his breakfast, save for a single cup of tea which he drank while pacing in front of the hearth with a listless intensity. A telegram lay on the table unopened, but he had already intuited its contents. "Carradine's solicitor confirmed an appointment," he muttered as I joined him by the fire. "At 10:30, Wellington Chambers, just off Chancery Lane. We mustn't be late." It was barely 10 when we stepped into the hansom, but Holmes, restless, urged the driver forward with uncharacteristic sharpness. I recognized the subtle change in his temperament. Less the showman now, more the strategist mid-game. Something about the sealed room, Branscom's cryptic inscription, and the strange absence of family history had stirred a deep suspicion in him. The office of Phelps and Ketteridge was a trim building of brick and brass, its windows modest and curtained, its signage minimal. We were shown to a private chamber on the second floor, where a narrow man in pince-nez awaited us, Mr. Harold Phelps, the firm's senior partner. His handshake was dry, his voice smooth. "You inquired regarding the late Mr. Branscom's estate," he said, motioning us to sit. Holmes nodded. Specifically the terms of his will and the nature of his holdings at Gresham House. Phelps adjusted his spectacles and pulled a large red ledger from a locked drawer. Mr. Branscom's affairs were unusually well ordered, I must say. Here, his most recent testament, executed 3 months before his passing. Holmes leaned forward as Phelps spread the papers across the desk. I observed his eyes scanning line by line with rapid, hungry precision. Occasionally he would pause, then continue as though playing a silent game of chess against the words. "Any mention," Holmes asked, "of a trust or condition tied to the property?" "Yes, Clause 9 here." Phelps tapped the paper. "It stipulates that the property known as Gresham House shall pass to Mr. Alfred Carradine, provided no rightful claim emerges from the descendants of the line of Enoch Branscombe. Failing that, the property reverts to the Crown after a holding period of 10 years. "Enoch Branscombe?" I echoed. "Was he a relative?" "A direct ancestor, the original title holder in 1784. But his line, we were long led to believe, died out in the early 1800s. Consumption, if I recall." Holmes's brow tightened, and yet the wording is precise. Descendants, not heirs. Phelps nodded. "Quite. The clause is a legal vestige from older forms of entailment, likely thought meaningless." "But it isn't," Holmes said coldly. "It is the knot at the center of the rope." Phelps blinked. "Mr. Phelps," Holmes continued, "are there any documents regarding Enoch Branscombe's descendants that have been locked or sealed under the firm's care?" "There is. One oddity." Phelps rose and fetched a flat box from the cabinet. "This came from the late Lord Branscombe's own safe. We received it 3 weeks before his death, to be held in trust." He placed the box before Holmes, who opened it slowly. Inside lay a brittle parchment envelope, the wax seal broken. The document within was yellowed but legible. It was a birth record, dated 1843. The child's name had been scrawled in faded brown ink, Emmeline Ada Branscombe. The mother's name was listed plainly, but the father's entry was scratched out. Beneath it, another line had been hastily added in pencil. "The girl was taken to the Ashwick Foundling Home by my hand. Let no one claim her unless the truth is needed." There was no signature. Watson said nothing. I, too, was silent. But Holmes exhaled sharply and closed the folder. "This child," he said, "was hidden. She did not die, and if she lived, her descendants would bear rightful claim to Gresham House, overriding Carradine's position entirely." "You believe Carradine knew?" I asked. "I believe," Holmes replied, "that someone in that house fears the truth of bloodlines more than the noose." He stood. "Mr. Phelps, I must borrow this record." Phelps frowned. "I'm not certain. I assure you it will return unscathed. But if a man was killed to keep this secret buried, then the law has already been outrun." He tucked the document into his inner pocket. Back in the hansom, Holmes stared out at the glistening streets, deep in thought. The rain smeared the glass like ink across parchment. "I must speak with the housekeeper again," he murmured at last. "Mrs. Kennett?" "She has a servant's memory and a mother's instinct. If anyone knows of a missing girl or a photograph removed or a name whispered and then forbidden, it will be her." I followed him, not yet seeing the end of the thread, but knowing Holmes had already glimpsed the shape of the knot. Chapter 11. The Woman at the Window. By the time we returned to Gresham House that afternoon, the mist had thickened into a pale shroud that drifted low over the lawns and clung to the hedgerows like a memory too stubborn to forget. Holmes was unusually quiet as we stepped from the carriage and ascended the steps, his hands folded behind his back, his eyes flicking upward toward the windows of the eastern wing. "Watson," he said in a hushed tone. "Do you recall the tapestries in the east corridor?" I thought back. Faded hunting scenes, were they not? Dogs and antlered stags. "And do you recall the wall behind them?" I shook my head. "Not particularly." "Exactly," Holmes said with a grim smile. "It is precisely what one does not recall that often proves vital." We were admitted by the housekeeper, Mrs. Kennet, who received us with a stiff nod and a look that betrayed less surprise than might have been expected. "I hoped you'd come back, sir," she said. "There's been more stirring about in the night. Third-floor landing again. Miss Clara swears she heard the creak of footsteps, but there was no one there." Holmes inclined his head. "We would like a word with you, Mrs. Kennet. Privately, if you please." She led us to the servants' parlour, a narrow, low-ceilinged room filled with the faint scent of coal ash and linseed oil. Holmes waited until the door clicked shut behind her before producing the folded birth record from his coat pocket. "Does this name mean anything to you?" he asked, placing it on the table. "Emmeline Ada Branscombe." Her hands trembled as she reached for the parchment, though she made no attempt to open it. Her mouth moved slightly, but no sound emerged. I don't know it," she said at last, but her voice lacked conviction. Holmes watched her in silence. "You were in service here 30 years, were you not?" he asked gently. She nodded, eyes fixed on her apron. "And before that?" "I was scullery maid at Ashwick Home for 3 years. It was a place for orphans, abandoned girls. Sometimes the parishes sent them, sometimes—" Her voice trailed off. Holmes sat opposite her and steepled his fingers. "A man brought a girl there in 1843. He wrote no name for himself, but swore the child was of noble blood. He asked that she be hidden." Mrs. Kennet's eyes widened, and I saw a strange conflict there, something between memory and loyalty. "There was such a child," she whispered. "Fair-haired, never spoke, wouldn't speak no matter what the matrons tried. They called her Emma Bright. But she didn't stay. She vanished one night during a thunderstorm. No one ever found her, just her shoes on the back stoop. Some thought she'd drowned in the river." Holmes gave a slow nod, as though that piece slid neatly into the puzzle he had already constructed in his mind. "Was there ever talk of a resemblance?" he asked. Mrs. Kennet hesitated. "There was a portrait in the drawing-room, one of the old ones, a woman in green velvet. Emma used to stare at it, like she knew her." Holmes leaned forward. "And that portrait? Where is it now?" Mrs. Kennet frowned. "It was taken down 5 years ago. Lord Branscombe had it moved. Said it gave him nightmares. He kept it in a locked storeroom behind the library. I haven't seen it since." Holmes rose immediately. "Then let us correct that oversight." We followed him through the main corridor, past the suits of armour and oil paintings, until we came to a narrow, panelled door that had been concealed behind a screen. Mrs. Kennet fumbled for a ring of keys, and after 3 tries, the lock yielded. Inside was a dusty chamber, lined with crates and moth-eaten drapery. Holmes strode directly to a large, cloth-shrouded canvas leaning against the far wall. He pulled the covering away. It was a portrait of a young woman with haunting eyes and pale hair pinned in braids, seated beside a marble table. Her hands were folded, and her expression held a quiet, pleading intensity. Around her neck was a green ribbon. Watson stepped back. "Holmes, she's—" "Yes," Holmes murmured. "The likeness is unmistakable. This is not merely a portrait. It is a mirror of blood. The girl in this painting is the mother of Emmeline, and she herself must have been the lost daughter of Enoch Branscombe. But then, the title of Gresham House was never Carradine's to inherit. The rightful line continued, quietly, shamefully, and someone knew. Someone tried to erase it." We stood in silence, the air thick with dust and revelation. Then Holmes turned suddenly. "One more thing, Mrs. Kennet. Miss Clara, was she ever adopted?" The old woman's face drained of colour. She came here as a companion years ago, but Lord Branscombe took a special interest in her, treated her almost like... Holmes gave a grim nod. "I believe Miss Clara is not merely a companion. She is a Branscombe, by blood." Watson stepped back, aghast. "Then she, not Carradine, is the heir." "And someone has tried to keep her in the shadows," Holmes said, "hidden behind politeness and invented lineage." He turned, his expression suddenly alert. "We must speak to her at once, and afterward we shall confront Carradine." But as we reached the stair, a maid came running toward us, breathless. "Miss Clara's gone, sir. Her bed is empty, and there's a note on her pillow." Holmes snatched the note and opened it swiftly, his face darkened. Watson leaned in. It read, in simple scrawl, "I remembered everything. I know now why the windows are bricked. I'm going to end what began there." We stared at each other. Holmes whispered, "She's gone to the room." Chapter 12. Behind. The bricked window. The candlelight trembled in Holmes's hand as we ascended the final flight of stairs, each step a drumbeat against the hush of Gresham House. The old banisters creaked under our grip. Though the house was vast, we moved as if through a tomb. No servants stirred, no clocks ticked. Only the distant hush of the wind in the ivy reminded us that time, however faintly, still moved. At the end of the third-floor landing stood a narrow wooden door, barely visible in the gloom. Holmes approached it with his usual quiet urgency, pausing only once to press his fingers against the latch. "She's beyond this," he murmured. "And I believe she's waited for this moment for many years." He opened the door slowly. The hinges groaned, and we stepped into the corridor beyond, the oldest wing of Gresham House, long disused. Dust hung in beams of moonlight. The air was thick with a faint, bitter scent, lime plaster, aged timber, and something older, sorrow, perhaps. At the end of the corridor stood a wall of cold grey stone. "No window," I whispered. Yet this was the southern face of the house. There should be sunlight. Holmes's eyes traced the seam of the bricks, his fingers brushing across uneven mortar. "This wall is no original part of the house," he said. "It was built to hide something, and someone." Then he knelt, brushing the floor with his gloved hand. There were faint scuff marks in the dust, boot prints, fresh. "She's been here," he said, "and not long ago." There was a sudden sound from within the wall, an echo, muffled and strange. Holmes rose instantly, rapping sharply on the stone. "Clara!" he called. Nothing. Then a soft thud. A pause. Then again. "She's inside," Holmes said. "There must be a hidden entrance." We searched along the wooden panelling beside the stonework. My hands moved over damp wainscot, and at last I found a notch, too shallow to be a handle, too precise to be an accident. Holmes pressed it. There was a faint click. A section of wall groaned open with a wheeze of air, revealing a narrow stone passage, barely large enough for one man to pass at a time. Holmes entered first, candle lifted high. The air within was colder still, and the floor dipped slightly. The stone gave way to old wooden planks. Then suddenly, we emerged into a chamber, a room utterly without windows. Clara stood at its centre. She wore her nightdress, her hair falling loose about her shoulders, and in her hands she held something wrapped in velvet. Her face, once pale with confusion, now held the fierce stillness of knowledge long denied. "I remembered," she said softly. "The dreams weren't dreams. They were echoes." Holmes approached slowly. "This is the room where she was kept." Clara nodded. "My mother, Emma. She lived here when she was brought back, after Ashwick. He locked her away, told the world she'd drowned. But she was alive, and I was born here, in this room." Watson's voice was quiet. "And who was your father?" Clara's gaze darkened. He never named himself. He came in the dark, but she kept something of his, hidden in the wall. She gestured toward the far side of the room, where a square of stone had been removed, the bricks crumbling at the edges. From the hollow, Clara withdrew the velvet bundle and unwrapped it. A dagger. Its hilt was silver, its blade long and ceremonial. But what chilled me most was the faded green ribbon still tied around the grip. Holmes took it gently, examining the ribbon. The same as in the portrait. "She tied it there," Clara whispered, "before she died. She left it for me." Watson glanced around. "This place, it's been sealed for decades." Clara stepped forward. "They told me I was adopted, but I was never allowed to leave the estate, always watched. I thought it was for my protection, but now I know. It was so I'd never ask." Holmes's voice was quiet but firm. "Carradine?" He knew. He found the letters. My mother wrote them before she died. They were hidden under the floorboards, sealed in a tin box. He burned them. But I saw one, just once. "And that," Holmes said, "was when the noises began again. The shadow behind the glass." Clara nodded. He thought I was mad. But I wasn't. I remembered her voice. I remembered her song. She stepped to the center of the room and looked up. She used to sing it to me through the cracks in the stone. The silence hung thick as a winding sheet. Holmes's eyes flicked once more to the walls, then to the dagger. "He feared your claim, that if the truth came out, the estate would be lost." Clara's voice hardened. "He tried to keep me silent, and when he realized I remembered, he sent the gardener." "The attack," I said, "the fall on the terrace. It wasn't an accident." Clara said nothing, but her silence was answer. "Enough." Holmes turned to Watson. "We must confront him, but not with accusations alone. We need proof." Clara gestured to the pile of rubble near the hidden wall. "There's more. The rest of the letters are behind that stone. I couldn't move it myself." Holmes moved at once, kneeling before the cavity and shifting the debris. Within minutes, his hands closed around a bundle, crackling parchment sealed with wax. He opened the first page carefully. Watson read over his shoulder. "To my daughter, should she ever know my name." Holmes stood slowly. "This is all we need. It is over." But Clara's eyes remained on the dagger in Holmes's hand. "He won't let it go quietly. You know that." Holmes met her gaze. "He will have no choice." We left the room in silence, the candlelight casting long shadows behind us. As we sealed the passage once more, Holmes paused at the door. "It is not often," he murmured, "that justice waits in silence for 30 years. And then, almost reverently, He tied the green ribbon once more around the hilt of the blade. Chapter 13. A veil, torn at dusk. The return to the main house was made in silence, save for the low creak of the floorboards under our shoes and the whisper of Clara's breath behind us. Holmes walked ahead with the bundle of letters tucked under one arm and the dagger concealed beneath his coat. The candle he carried had burned low, its flame no longer fierce, but flickering like a soul caught between past and present. We passed through the lower corridor, emerging again into the drawing room, where the fire had long since gone out. The portrait of Gresham's matriarch still hung above the hearth, staring blankly forward, ribbon braided at her wrist. Clara moved to the armchair, but did not sit. She stood with her back to the fire grate, hands clasped tightly in front of her, staring down at the hearthstone as if it might open to reveal another secret. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, please take the letters to my satchel in the carriage. Lock them inside." I nodded and made my way out into the wind, which had picked up sharply. Leaves scurried across the drive like whispers fleeing into the night. As I stepped onto the porch, I glanced toward the far hedgerow and froze. A figure stood just beyond the outer gate, unmoving, watching. The shape was tall, cloaked in black, with a walking stick crooked at the elbow. Carradine. He turned as I locked eyes with him. Then he vanished behind the trellis before I could speak. I returned with haste. "He's here," I said to Holmes. "Carradine, at the gate." Holmes did not seem surprised. "Then it begins." He turned to Clara. "I need you to remain in this room. Lock the doors. If you hear my voice, open, no one else's." She nodded, eyes wide but steady. She had passed from terror to determination, the sort that blossoms only in those who have long been silenced. We stepped into the corridor, the light from Holmes's lantern casting our twin shadows along the walls. The old house seemed alive with listening. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind through the panes, now felt purposeful. At the foot of the stairs stood Carradine. He had discarded his overcoat and now stood in waistcoat and gloves, his dark eyes gleaming beneath his heavy brows. He did not flinch when Holmes approached. "Mr. Holmes," he said calmly, "I had hoped our paths would not need to cross again tonight." Holmes's expression was unreadable. On the contrary, I find dusk the perfect hour for unmasking. Carradine raised a brow. "Unmasking, is it? A theatrical word. A fitting one. You have concealed the truth behind theatricality for quite some time, but even a mask, when worn too long, leaves an imprint." Carradine took a slow step forward. "You presume much. I observe much. For instance, your insistence that Clara was adopted while no documentation exists, the servant's unspoken fear of the Eastern Wing, and now the dagger, with your family's ribbon, hidden behind a wall you had bricked up yourself." Carradine stiffened. "You trespassed." "We uncovered," Holmes corrected, "a difference in both action and morality." He stepped closer, voice cold and crisp as glass. "Emma was never dead, was she? You took her back from Ashwick under the name of a distant cousin, hid her away when she would not submit to your plans. Her child was born in secret, and rather than risk scandal, you locked them both away, until one was buried, and the other forgot." Carradine's silence was louder than any denial. "You speak as though from certainty," he said finally. "I speak from evidence." Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew one of the letters. He handed it, unsealed, to Carradine. Carradine read only the first few lines before his face darkened. She wrote these under, fever, delirium. She wrote them under duress, Holmes said, but not madness. Her words are clear and damning. Carradine's hand trembled as he lowered the paper. What do you want? Justice. The word dropped like a stone between them. Carradine's jaw tightened. And if I refuse? Holmes took a measured step forward. Then I make it public. Every letter, every brick you laid, Scotland Yard, the courts, the papers, your name will be stained in every ledger in London, and your niece will inherit the estate without contest. A long pause. Then Carradine chuckled, a hollow sound. So it has come to this. Blackmail dressed as righteousness. No, Holmes said, his voice steady. It is righteousness dressed in inevitability. Carradine looked away. Then, to my great surprise, he slowly removed a key from his coat and handed it to Holmes. It unlocks the desk in my study. There is a will there. Emma's original, signed and witnessed. I never destroyed it, only hid it, some part of me. He did not finish the thought. Holmes took the key. Carradine raised his eyes. You win, Mr. Holmes. But know this. I acted not out of cruelty, but fear. Fear of what exposure would do to this house, to our name. To your name, Holmes corrected, not hers. Carradine turned without another word and walked into the darkness of the corridor, his steps slow, his figure dissolving into shadow. Holmes and I remained still for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, Come, Watson. Let us fetch the will. The dawn will require proof. As we made our way to the study, I asked, And Clara? Holmes looked back toward the room where she waited. She will be free, at last. And in the silence that followed, I fancied I heard the faintest sound from above, a single, brittle note of song, like a memory finding its voice again after years of forced stillness. Chapter 14. The lock that turned without a key. The study door groaned open as Holmes inserted the ornate brass key Carradine had surrendered. Its weight in his hand, he had remarked, was like the weight of the man's conscience, long denied, but now pressing down with final inevitability. We stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of cedar and ink, and the air held a sense of order too perfect to be sincere. Books were stacked with obsessive precision, their spines uncreased. An oil lamp, recently extinguished, left a faint trail of smoke curling near the ceiling. On the far side of the room sat the desk, massive, claw-footed, and carved with ivy patterns that curled like secrets around its edges. Holmes moved directly to it, setting the key to its lock. The mechanism clicked with a reluctant turn. He pulled open the middle drawer with the elegance of one lifting a veil. Inside were documents, dozens of them. Most were banal, property ledgers, correspondence, personal receipts. But beneath them, wrapped in tissue, yellowed with time, lay a folder bound in twine. Holmes untied it with a careful motion. He unfolded the top sheet, and I watched his eyes flick across the page with growing intensity. Well? I asked. He laid the document on the desk so I could see. The ink was faded but legible. A last will and testament, Emma Gresham. The signature, though weakened at the end, was unmistakable. Witnesses had signed it, one a nurse from Ashwick, the other a local vicar, both dated just before the child's birth. She named the girl Clara, Holmes murmured. Not as a ward, not as a cousin, as her daughter, sole heir to the Gresham estate. And Carradine knew, I said. Of course, he buried this truth as carefully as he buried her mother. But the truth, Watson, is like a seed in a wall. It finds the smallest crack. Holmes closed the folder and tucked it into his coat. Let us return to Miss Gresham. We found her, where we had left her, still in the drawing room, though now seated, hands folded in her lap, face pale and unreadable. She stood as we entered. "Well?" she asked. Her voice did not shake, but there was something brittle in it, like frost on glass. Holmes did not hand her the will. Not yet. He sat across from her and regarded her with unusual softness. "Miss Gresham, what I am about to say may change the course of your life. But you must receive it not as a blow, but as a door long kept shut, now opening." She nodded slowly, eyes fixed on his. "You were not adopted. You are not a cousin's child. Your mother was Emma Gresham. She gave birth to you in secret, then returned to this house under her brother's supervision. She lived hidden in the East Wing until her death." Clara's hands slowly rose to her mouth. Her breath caught, but she did not weep. Not yet. "She wrote letters," Holmes continued. "Dozens of them, hidden in the panel behind her dressing mirror. She never stopped, loving you, nor regretting her silence." Clara closed her eyes, and a single tear broke free, trailing down her cheek with the solemnity of a bell tolling once in a church tower. "You have a right to this house, this name and this truth," Holmes said. "Your uncle has confessed, if not aloud, then by surrender. We have recovered your mother's will. You are the heir." She looked at him for a long time. Then, in a voice more resolved than I had yet heard from her, she said, "And what becomes of him?" "That is not for us to decide," Holmes said, "whether you wish to prosecute, forgive, or simply let the law do its work. That is your right." Clara looked toward the dark window. For years I felt something in these walls, like a shadow that moved just behind the corner of sight. I thought it was madness, but it was memory. She turned back. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes." He inclined his head. We stayed that night at Gresham House, by Clara's quiet insistence. It was nearly midnight when I retired to my room, one of the guest chambers overlooking the southern slope. But Holmes remained downstairs, seated in the study, the lamplight flickering across his hands as he played slow, reflective notes on the violin. The melody was not mournful, but neither was it bright. It sounded like something that had been waiting a long time to be heard. In the morning, Clara was gone. She left a note, written in delicate but steady hand. "I have gone to Ashwick to see the place where she last stood free. I do not run. I simply wish to walk the path backward before I walk it forward as myself." The constable arrived that afternoon, summoned discreetly by Holmes. Carradine did not resist arrest. He only asked, before being led away, that Clara not be made to speak against him. "She has endured enough silence," he said. "Let me take it with me now." And so the shadow that had lived too long in Gresham House was drawn out, not with fury, but with finality. Holmes and I departed shortly after. The sky had turned iron grey, and a wind rose over the hills like a hymn half remembered. In the carriage, I turned to him. "You knew almost from the start." He nodded. "The locked room was never about intrusion, but about hiding something within. A crime not against property, but against memory." I glanced back toward the shrinking silhouette of the manor. "Do you think she'll come back?" Holmes was silent a moment, then, very softly, "Only when the house no longer remembers the lies it was built to hold." Chapter 15. The gathering at Baker Street. The winter light that filtered through the lace curtains of 221B Baker Street held the faint yellow of early thaw, though the streets outside still wore their coats of soot and cold. It was 3 days since our return from Gresham House, and Holmes had scarcely left his armchair, save to pace now and again, or to play a few measured notes on the violin before abandoning it mid-phrase. He smoked more than usual, and though he answered my questions readily, his gaze often lingered on a place in the room where no object lay, only memory. It was on the fourth morning that Inspector Gregson arrived, his coat dusted with frost and his moustache visibly twitching with barely concealed agitation. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, standing before the fireplace, "we've got Carradine at Newgate, but there's pressure mounting. The Home Office wants this matter settled cleanly, and soon." Holmes waved his pipe vaguely. "And is that not precisely the danger, my dear Gregson, that you might settle it too cleanly?" Gregson frowned. The man confessed. To a fraction of the truth, yes. He admitted to suppressing the will. That alone would merit criminal charges. But that is not the matter which truly interests me. The inspector tilted his head. "Go on." Holmes stood, crossing to the window and peering out at the street below. "I have invited all remaining parties to this room at noon. Miss Gresham will be present. So too will Reverend Silas, the housekeeper Mrs. Harland, and, at my particular insistence, a certain Mr. Bertrand Langley." Gregson stiffened. Langley? The solicitor? Indeed, a rather elusive man these last few days, but I have reason to believe his involvement in the affair runs deeper than Carradine's confession implies. Watson, seated beside the hearth, spoke for the first time. "Do you suspect forgery?" Holmes turned. "Number. The will is authentic, but the delay in its execution, nearly 2 decades, required more than Carradine's silence. It required legal complicity. Langley was the executor of Emma Gresham's estate, yet failed to produce the document after her death. I find that omission curious, do you not?" Gregson rubbed his chin. "I had not considered—" "No," Holmes interrupted. "You hadn't. And that is precisely why this conversation must unfold under one roof." At exactly noon, the bell rang downstairs, and moments later Mrs. Hudson ushered in Clara Gresham. She looked altogether different from the young woman we had first met. Her posture had firmed, her eyes sharpened, and though the grief had not left her face, it now sat alongside a strength that suggested a woman shaping herself anew from long-buried truths. Behind her came Reverend Silas, his clerical collar tight against his neck, followed by Mrs. Harland, whose hands twisted the handle of her purse with quiet anxiety. Then, with an air of reluctant formality, entered Bertrand Langley, his coat brushed, his cravat perfectly tied, yet a subtle sheen of sweat gathering at his temples. "Please," Holmes gestured, "be seated." They took their places, Langley choosing the farthest chair from Holmes, Clara remaining near the hearth. Holmes began without preamble. "We are here not to dredge up scandal, but to clarify the past in order to cleanse the present. Miss Gresham has been denied her birthright not by accident, but by design. Mr. Carradine may have shielded the world from Emma Gresham's truth, but he did not act alone." Langley shifted. "Are you accusing me of conspiracy, Mr. Holmes?" "I accuse you of silence," Holmes replied, his tone measured. "A solicitor's duty is to execute the wishes of the deceased. Emma Gresham's will, which you received in sealed form, was never entered into probate. Instead, you accepted a verbal assertion from Carradine that the child had died in infancy and that the will was nullified. You did not verify, you did not investigate, you simply obeyed." Langley's voice rose slightly. "I had no reason to doubt him. The man was the head of the family." "Precisely," Holmes snapped with sudden heat. "That was the reason to doubt him. He had motive, he had means, and you, sir, had the law on your side, and you turned your back on it. Mrs. Harland let out a small gasp. I remember seeing him with a packet of letters. Emma's. He said he was burning them. Holmes turned to her gently. And why did you not come forward? I was afraid. After Miss Emma died, things in that house grew silent. Not quiet, silent, as if something was watching from the walls. Holmes nodded once. Silence is often the accomplice of cruelty. He then turned to Reverend Silas. And you, sir, you witnessed the will, you confirmed it. Why did you not question its absence in the years that followed? The Reverend bowed his head. I was told the child had died and the will had no meaning. First period. Regret my inaction, Mr. Holmes. Holmes returned to Clara. Miss Gresham, you may now act with the full force of law. You may press charges, reclaim your inheritance, and, if you wish, take civil action against those who suppressed your birthright. She looked around the room. Mr. Langley, Reverend Silas, if you were complicit, it was in weakness, not malice. But that does not excuse you. Langley stood. Miss Gresham, I will resign from the firm immediately, and if you bring suit, I will not contest it. She did not thank him. Holmes rose as well. Then our gathering is concluded. As the others filed out, Clara lingered behind. To think, she said softly, that I lived in a house filled with ghosts, not of the dead, but of choices never made. Holmes smiled faintly. Ghosts walk more quietly than liars, Miss Gresham, but their truths endure. She left, and for a moment the silence in Baker Street was absolute. Chapter 16. The thread pulled tight. It was just after dusk when Holmes summoned me back into the sitting room of 221B, where a fresh sheet of notes now rested atop the mantel. The lamplight cast a golden hue over the green velvet curtains and the smoke-filled air, and Holmes, cross-legged in his armchair, stared fixedly at the fire, as though its shifting light might whisper the final truth. "You've been very quiet since the gathering," I remarked as I sat across from him. "I have been listening, Watson," he replied. "Not to voices, but to absences. That, as you may well know, is where the final answers often hide." He handed me a note. It was a page torn from the visitors' registry of the Gresham House drawing room, retrieved, I presumed, during one of Holmes's silent disappearances over the past day. On it, in neat script, was a single entry from 14 years prior. Mr. Thomas Redhill, representing Langley and March, solicitors. I raised an eyebrow. Redhill. A name we have not heard until now, a partner of Langley's, or rather a legal instrument placed quietly into the narrative at just the right moment. Holmes rose and began to pace. You recall Langley's claim that he merely filed what Carradine told him? Of course, that the child, Clara, was never formally acknowledged. Indeed. But then, what business had a representative of his firm at Gresham House after Emma Gresham's death, long after the will had supposedly been dismissed? Holmes didn't wait for an answer. He strode to his desk and uncovered a telegram, which he tapped with 2 fingers. "I inquired after Mr. Redhill. There is no solicitor by that name on record in Langley and March, nor, I might add, in any legitimate registry of the Inns of Court." Then, who was he? A fiction, a fabrication, but not Langley's invention. I suspect it was orchestrated by Carradine, who feared Langley's potential scruples. Rather than present the will himself, he arranged for it to appear verified through a false intermediary, Redhill, thus freeing Langley of direct moral responsibility. Clever, but clumsy. Holmes's tone turned sharp. This entire affair has been one long chain of deliberate omissions. Not outright lies, Watson, but half-truths. Just enough to tilt the scales of inheritance without tipping them over. He returned to his chair and folded his hands beneath his chin. There is one last move to make. Tonight. I leaned forward. Another trap. Holmes smiled faintly. Not a trap, my dear fellow. An invitation. He then outlined his plan. We would return to Gresham House under cover of darkness. Miss Gresham would meet us there with a sealed letter, one Holmes had dictated that very morning, addressed to Carradine in his cell at Newgate. The contents were simple but potent. A fictitious claim that new evidence had surfaced, implicating a second party, and a final chance to revise his statement to reduce his sentence. "It will shake the tree," Holmes said, "and something, or someone, will fall." By 9 o'clock that evening we stood again before the looming silhouette of Gresham House. The snow from earlier in the week had hardened into frost along the flagstones. The great iron gate creaked open under Holmes' gloved hand, and we entered the estate like ghosts. Clara was waiting in the drawing-room, the sealed envelope already in her hand. She did not ask what it contained. Her eyes were distant, steady. "I'm not afraid any more," she said simply. Holmes inclined his head. "Good. Then let us make them afraid." He took the envelope and placed it prominently atop the escritoire in the parlour, the very same desk where Emma Gresham's will had once been written. Then we waited. The house breathed quietly, old wood shifting in the cold. Holmes stood in the corner, motionless, while I sat near the fire, my revolver concealed beneath the folds of my coat. Clara remained near the door, poised like a figure in oil. Midnight came, and then soft footsteps. Not from the entrance, but from behind the walls, from somewhere deep within the corridors of Gresham House. A faint click, a panel shifting, the sound of careful hands moving across paper. Holmes moved swiftly. He stepped out from the shadows, striking a match with one sharp motion. The light flared and caught the face of Mrs. Harland, the housekeeper, her expression frozen mid-theft as she stood over the envelope, trembling. Watson and I rushed forward, but Holmes raised a hand. "No need, gentlemen. She will not flee." Mrs. Harland collapsed into the high-backed chair by the desk. "You knew," Clara whispered. "All this time, you knew about me." "I nursed you," the housekeeper murmured, not looking at her. "Emma wanted you hidden from the world. Your father was already dead. She feared Carradine would find a way to bury your name if he knew you lived. She left the will and made me promise." "And when Carradine took over the estate?" Holmes asked softly. I kept silent. I feared him. And I thought, if Clara grew up safe, what harm in letting sleeping lies remain? "You didn't count on Holmes," Watson muttered. Holmes stepped closer. "Mrs. Harland, you tampered with the letter not to protect yourself but to protect someone else. Who?" The housekeeper looked up, eyes shining with exhausted sorrow. "Langley." Holmes nodded slowly. "He loved Emma, didn't he?" Mrs. Harland gave a faint nod, and she him quietly, but he couldn't defy Carradine outright. They had business ties, secrets. So he waited, and when Carradine suppressed the will, Langley let it happen. He told himself he would fix it later. He never did. There was a long silence. Holmes turned to Clara. "Your inheritance will stand. The courts will sort the rest. But justice, true justice, often takes stranger forms." She nodded, not triumphantly, but with the gravity of one who has finally reached the shore after many years adrift. As we departed Gresham House for the final time, Holmes paused at the threshold. "I find," he said almost to himself, that the deepest mysteries are not those of crime, but of silence, of what people choose not to say. Watson looked at him. "And will you put this case to paper?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Number, let this one remain a ribbon left untied." Chapter 17. The Quiet Arrest. The events at Gresham House, though discreetly managed, made their way through private corridors of law and influence with an almost imperceptible momentum. Within 48 hours of Holmes's final visit to the estate, a warrant was quietly issued, not for Mrs. Harland, nor for Clara Gresham, but for Mr. Langley, the solicitor whose firm had been curiously silent across a decade of false documentation. Not for what he did, Holmes explained as we walked along the fog-draped pavement near the inner temple, but for what he chose to ignore. There is, after all, such a thing as criminal omission. We reached the narrow office corridor of Langley and March, a place lined with ledgers and the soft scent of dust that clung like guilt to the walls. Holmes had arranged the meeting under the pretext of requiring assistance in an unrelated probate matter, a ruse designed to disarm the solicitor and make the final moment strike with precision. Langley received us in a quiet room panelled with walnut, the curtains half drawn against the drizzle outside. He appeared thinner than when we'd first met him, his complexion worn, as if the ghosts Holmes had stirred had begun their quiet hauntings already. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice perfectly even, "I had not expected to see you again. I trust the matter concerning the late Emma Gresham has come to a close." Holmes gave a small bow. "Almost. We are, in fact, at the final stage. One last signature, so to speak, and the document shall be complete." Langley offered a tight smile, then glanced at me. "And Dr. Watson remains the faithful witness?" "As ever," I replied, though my eyes were watching his hands, calm, still, folded in guilt or resignation. Holmes sat without invitation and removed a slip of paper from his coat. "Do you recall this name, Mr. Langley? Thomas Redhill?" Langley's mouth moved, but no sound emerged for a moment. Then, "No. Should I?" Holmes laid the visitor's registry page upon the table. "It is curious. This man signed into Gresham House the day after Emma's passing, representing your firm, and yet, according to the Inns of Court and the Royal College of Solicitors, no such man ever existed. Nor is he known in your offices." Langley's composure fractured, subtly but tellingly. The slight twitch of his temple, the shift of a knee under the table. "I cannot account for every minor clerk who may have used our name improperly," he said after a moment. "It is possible—" Holmes cut him off. "You forget, sir, that Gresham House kept meticulous records. The name was not written by a fraudster. It was written in your hand." Silence expanded like smoke between us. Holmes leaned forward, voice cool and exact. "You could not bring yourself to destroy the will outright. That would have been criminal, but you delayed. You made the copy disappear into procedural shadow, allowing Carradine to distribute the estate unjustly while you kept your conscience folded behind plausible deniability." Langley looked down. "It was never supposed to go that far." "But it did," Holmes said, rising, "and in the process, you aided and abetted a deception which nearly erased the life of Clara Gresham. She will now reclaim what is hers, but you must account for your part in the concealment." There was a quiet knock. The door opened, and Inspector Hopkins stepped inside, cap in hand. "Mr. Langley," he said, "you'll come with us, sir." To Langley's credit, he did not protest. He stood, gathered his overcoat and turned to Holmes with a weary nod. "Will she hate me, do you think?" Holmes replied gently. number, but she will never write your name again." As the door shut behind them, Holmes exhaled deeply, not in triumph, but as if discharging a final unspoken burden. We returned to Baker Street under a sky of low, slate-grey clouds. Holmes refused tea, took instead his pipe, and stood by the window watching the carriages pass like black thoughts along the street. "Tell me, Holmes," I said after some time, "did you ever suspect Harland as the principal architect of the deception?" He shook his head. She was the conscience, the hidden one, who kept memory alive in her own way. It was Langley who bound the dagger's ribbon and Carradine who thrust it. Harland only watched it fall. "And Clara," Holmes turned to me, eyes distant. "She will be free at last, but not untouched. The past does not dissolve, it imprints." I reached for my notebook. "And shall I write it down, this case? Shall I give it a title?" Holmes considered, then offered a small smile. "Call it what you like, Watson. But know this, the most curious room in Gresham House was not the windowless one. It was the space they tried to erase, the room in which the truth was kept, locked without light." He tapped the ash from his pipe and returned to his violin, drawing the bow in a slow, almost mournful stroke. The tune was minor, haunting, and unfinished, just like the shadows of Gresham House. Chapter 18. The Room That Remembered. It was nearly a fortnight later, on a Sunday of uncommon stillness, when Holmes and I returned to Gresham House, not as investigators, but as silent observers of a world slowly healing itself. The long legal wrangling had begun, the rightful claim reasserted by Clara Gresham, with a clarity that could no longer be disputed. The affair of the windowless room had become a closed chapter in the eyes of the world, but for Holmes, as always, the conclusion lay not in the paperwork or arrests, but in the understanding. We found Miss Gresham in the rose garden, tending to a half-wild bloom that had survived unpruned, its branches thorned and wandering as if left to grow in grief. "You've come to see it one last time, haven't you?" she said, not turning to greet us. "The room, I mean." Holmes gave a soft nod. "If it would not trouble you." She rose and led the way without another word, her boots silent over the gravel. The house still bore its habitual silence, but the atmosphere had shifted, not lighter but clearer, like a fog had lifted, revealing the sorrow rather than concealing it. The door to the windowless room creaked open once again. It was as it had been, Spartan, airless, the desk untouched, the walls still holding the faint trace of smoke from long-extinguished candles. But now there was something else. A photograph, framed and placed gently on the desk. It was of Emma Gresham, taken before the shadows fell, young, sharp-eyed and vibrant with a defiance that defied the fate she'd met. Holmes stepped inside and ran a finger across the spine of the ledger left behind by Harland. "There are rooms in this world," he said quietly, "that are not meant for the living. They become repositories of what others wish to forget." I stood at the threshold, not wishing to cross it again. "You were right, Holmes. The mystery was never about how a room could exist without windows, but how a life could vanish without notice." He turned to Clara. "Miss Gresham, I do not believe in ghosts, but I believe in memory. It persists, often silently and sometimes vengefully." She smiled, though it trembled. "And yet, without your memory, Mr. Holmes, I would have remained buried in hers." Outside, the sound of late summer wind passed through the trees like a whisper of acknowledgement. We left her there, not as a ward, nor as a mystery, but as a woman with her name returned, and her house, though changed, made her own. As we rode back to London that evening, the smoke of the city rising in great curling plumes beyond the horizon, Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet. I waited until we reached the lamplit stillness of Baker Street before speaking. "You never told me what convinced you first, that something was wrong." He lit his pipe and leaned into the chair with a sigh that sounded more thoughtful than tired. "The ledger, Watson, not its content, but the fact that it existed at all. Harland said the room was sealed off for 20 years, yet the records were kept with precision, every date in order. No one maintains meticulous records in exile unless they expect the truth to return." I blinked. "You believed someone, Harland, was preserving the truth, not hiding it?" "Indeed. And that meant someone else had gone to great lengths to ensure the truth remained buried. Langley played the long game, but even the most cautious man cannot suppress a ghost once it learns to speak." I sat with that for a moment, then reached for my pen. "And how shall I title this one?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Call it the Windowless Room at Gresham House if you must. But understand, the true mystery lay not in what the room lacked, but what it remembered." He closed his eyes, as though retreating inward, the case already folded and filed in that infinite archive of his mind. And I, faithful chronicler, dipped my pen once more, knowing the world would remember, because I would write it. And Holmes, as always, would vanish behind the veil of another solved silence.